against each other, which they call a tiebreaker or a play-in game, and the winner is in and the loser plays golf instead.
Has that ever happened?
Yes, it's happened, every now and then, every few years.
Because wild card is a relatively new thing in baseball history.
Yeah, but it can be that two teams can tie for the division championship also, and they might have to have a tiebreaker game. So yeah, it happens every now and then, and it's pretty exciting because baseball goes for such a long time, and then to have it all come down to one game is really a big change.
So there's two leagues, American and National, right?
And by the way, both of those names lie because the American League has a team in Canada, and the National League used to have a team in Canada. So even though American and National, not so.
Not so. And there's always been like the two leagues?
More or less. There have been other leagues now and then, but they haven't lasted. Since about 1901, there have been the two leagues, American and National League, and they play in the World Series at the end of every year, except when they get greedy and call it off because of a labor dispute, which happened one time.
When did that happen?
That happened in 1994.
Oh, I don't remember that. I'm sure it happened.
Well, thank you.
I was a follower of baseball in the early 90s to mid 90s because my local team then was Toronto, and they were doing
One
well.
of the lying teams.
The one who was in the American League.
Right.
Yeah. So, I was a baseball fan because my local team was winning, and when they stopped winning a lot, then I lost interest.
We call that a fair weather fan.
Yeah, exactly. I was a fair weather fan.
Another term for that is being on the bandwagon.
Yes, I was on the bandwagon.
That's all right. There's nothing wrong with that.
I was in college, so they played the World Series right during midterms every year, so I could never watch any of it. It really bummed me out.
I think maybe your priorities were incorrect there.
I should have watched the games instead.
Oh, yeah.
I tried doing both. It
Okay.
didn't work out too well. So we have East, Central, and West for both leagues.
Right.
And then they have the World Series, which is, a competition between the two leagues.
Right.
The World Series, now if I remember correctly, there was a newspaper called The World.
You remember The World? How old are you?
I remember talk of The World.
Okay,
I remember
all right.
The World.
Okay. The New York World.
New York World.
Yes.
So they decided to sponsor a contest between the two big leagues at the time.
Yep. Because the leagues were rivals and they never played each other. In fact, the older league was the National. It barely acknowledged that the American existed. And the World had an idea that the champions would play each other at the end of the year, and that would be heavily promoted. They would promote it in the newspaper, and a lot of fans would come to see it.
And then the World ceased to be somehow. They folded.
Because newspapers do that.
And print was dead even back then.
I guess so.
Yeah. So then, did Major League Baseball just come along and continue it?
Pretty much. The leagues just kept going because it was a good idea. The fans loved it. Radio eventually and television got involved, and people just liked the idea, sports fans, of a playoff to find out who's the best team. Just to leave it out there hanging that there are two teams claiming it is not as much fun or as much money making as having them play each other. So the World Series actually outlived the New York World by probably 80 years so far.
Oh, so it's like 1920s?
I think so, yeah.
All right. So when they started out the World Series, there were the two leagues.
Yes.
So there wasn't not yet a Major League Baseball league that encompassed the whole thing.
Yeah.
Like an NT.
Although that's a fairly minor detail. Nowadays there's a thing called Major League Baseball, and both the leagues work together. Back then they were rivals, and they didn't work together very much, only for things like the World Series. After a while, something came along called the All-Star Game, which in the middle of the summer, the best players from one league would play a special game against the best players from the other league, and so they worked together that way. And eventually they figured out that if they just sort of pooled their resources and worked together, that they would be better off all the way around. And that's what was called Major League Baseball. And they kept the World Series going all the time.
So have the leagues, like, management kind of merged?
Yes. Yeah, there used to be a president of the National League and a president of the American League, and those went away. There used to be different umpires who worked in one league versus the other, and now that's not true anymore. There's one man who's commissioner of baseball, and he's pretty much the executive power for both leagues. Okay. Now, the teams still don't play each other very much.
Right.
They still pretty much stay in their own leagues. There are special times during the year where they play what are called interleague games, but mostly they've merged in that way.
Okay. How are the rules different between American League and National League?
There's only one substantial rule that's different. In the American League, the pitcher doesn't have to come to bat. In the American League, there's a player called designated hitter. And typically, this is a player who does nothing but bat, and the pitcher doesn't bat. So you can have one player who only bats, and it can be for anybody, but it's usually for the pitcher. The National League doesn't have that rule. And fans love to argue about which league is better, whether the rule is great or bad. And it's really interesting when the leagues play each other.
What happens when the leagues play each other? What rule do they use?
I was so hoping you'd ask. When they play each other, they use the rule of the home team. So whether it's during the season or in the World Series, whichever team is at home, they use that league's rules. So that means if you play in an American League park, the National League team also gets to use the designated hitter. Because you can't have different rules for two teams in the same game. That would be pretty unfair.
Right. So you could have a pitcher who never bats all year, except maybe when they play in the World Series.
Exactly.
And maybe like the interleague play that they occasionally do.
Yeah, so American League pitchers are exactly like that. And they do things like look really bad and hurt themselves running the bases. But once in a while they get a big hit, and it's pretty cool, unless it's against your team. And then it's not cool.
Right. All right. I had a question in my mind, and then it left me.
There are so many questions about baseball. It's such a rich sport with a long history. So I can understand how they could be flowing through your mind.
When did professional baseball, start being played in this country?
Professional baseball started in, I believe, 1869. There was one professional team that would go around barnstorming and playing local teams. They were called the Cincinnati Red Stockings, and they were kind of the forerunner to the Cincinnati Reds that came about later when the league started. In fact, they were called the Reds for a long time, and then you might have heard in the 50s that we had something called the Red Scare in this country when...
You're worried about communism?
Exactly, and Reds were communists. So for a while they had to change their name to the Redlegs. They couldn't call them the Cincinnati Reds anymore as part of the change.
Now, Red Stockings sounds an awful lot like Red Sox.
Yes.
Is there any relation?
Not
there?
directly. You know, the Boston Red Sox
Right.
was another team later, but the Cincinnati Red Stockings became the Reds.
And their mascot now, is that what's your mascot now?
The Reds?
Yeah, the Reds.
I think it's an old-fashioned guy with a baseball head. But I'm not sure, because they change mascots.
Oh, okay. So you have the Reds and the Red Sox, and there's also a
Yes.
team called the White Sox.
Yes, there is.
What city are they from?
Chicago White Sox.
Chicago White Sox.
There've been and there's a team called the Colorado Springs Sky Sox, and there was a team called Utica Blue Sox. Sox are really big in baseball nicknames.
What's the deal with Sox?
Sox? Everybody wears them, I guess, and
And it's always misspelled, is that right?
SOX. Yeah.
SOX.
Traditionally spelled that way.
So you had the Cincinnati Reds.
Yes.
As like, let's say, the first
The first professional team.
team. And they just played other non-professional teams.
Yes.
So
Town teams, local
It's kind of like the
teams.
Harlem Globetrotters. When they come to your town, they're pros and they're going to win it.
Yeah, but they drag their own opponent along with them. The Globetrotters do.
Oh, so they play, okay, they bring the opponent with them.
Yes.
So they're trained not to win or something.
Exactly, yeah.
So how did you evolve from there? You had the one pro team. How did the more teams come into play?
So late in the 19th century, teams got together, the best teams, and started forming leagues. And there were a number of leagues in the late 19th century, like there was a league called the American Association and a league called the National League. And in fact, the National League that we have today was formed in about 1876, and it's been in existence continuously ever since then. So long time.
And so how many teams did they have back then?
Well, by 1900 they had 8 teams, and that's what's called the modern era, the beginning of the modern era of baseball.
Okay.
And there were 8 teams in the National and 8 teams in the American League, all the way up till 1954. And all those teams, the farthest west any of those teams were was St. Louis. So it was pretty much
It's a very Eastern
very much, yeah.
sport.
There were other teams that would play in the West, but they were what's called minor league teams. And the problem was travel, because there was no commercial air travel, and it was just really hard to take a train like from, say, St. Louis to San Francisco.